All right, it is past 6, so I will get this webinar started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Visions of Wild Utah webcast. My name is Allie Fisher, and I'll be your MC for tonight. I'm the new Communications and EDI Associate, and I am honored to introduce our very special guest from Oregonians for Wild Utah. The main presentation will be followed by a brief update on efforts to protect wild and scenic rivers in Oregon, and then we'll finish off with some Q&A at the last few minutes. So starting off, Steve Corbetto was first introduced to the red rock of southern Utah by his field geologist father in the early 1970s. Since then, he has been able to consider Utah's sections of the Colorado Plateau and the Great Basin from geologic, ecological, hydrologic, archaeological, and even astrophysical perspectives. He returned to Portland in 2015 and later helped to start Oregonians for Wild Utah, or OFWU. Lorenz Bush moved to Portland in November 2019 after hiking the Pacific Crest Trail, and he currently works at Snow Peak and is a freelance journalist for Yellow Scene magazine, which is based out of Boulder, Colorado. Lorenz fell in love with Utah while working as a guide at the wilderness program there and joined OFWU in January 2020. And lastly, we have Kelsey Kagan, who is an Oregon native and a recently published author of a book, A Curiously Different Dog. She has lived in Utah previously and loves to return to explore the wilderness, and she co-leads OFWU. And then we're also joined by Oregon Wild's Wilderness Program Manager, Eric Fernandez. I would like to include a land acknowledgement in this space. I would like to offer gratitude to the land itself and for those who have lived here in Oregon since time immemorial. Not just the forests, rivers, mountains, and deserts that all of us at Oregon Wild celebrate and work to conserve, but also places of art, industry, science, commerce, and community that are built upon these lands. I would like to acknowledge the continuing presence of Indigenous peoples on the land today, as well as historical events, including colonial legacies and wrongdoings that have had long-lasting and current impacts. Additionally, a recording of this program will be emailed out tomorrow, and it will be posted on our website, OregonWild.org, and the Wild blog. Please do enter your questions at any time in the chat box because we get a flood of these normally at the end. So the sooner you can get those in, the easier it is for me to organize and ask them at the end of the presentation. And then if you purchased a raffle ticket, thank you. Your support allows us to continue doing these presentations and the work that we do. And the raffle will be open through this evening. So if after the presentation you decide you'd like to enter, you can do that by finding this event on the Oregon Wild homepage. Winners will be selected tomorrow and contacted by email to verify shipping addresses. And with that being said, I'll pass it off to Steve.
Thanks, Allie. It's great to be here. I want to thank Oregon Wild for hosting us and thank everybody who joined us. As Allie introduced us, we're three members of a group called Oregonians for Wild Utah, and all of us are sort of have ties back to Utah and are Oregonians now, but we still fundamentally care about the protection of Utah wilderness. Personally, I've been a member of the advocacy group Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance for over 30 years and have watched these battles to really protect that land go on not only in courtrooms but in Congress and other forums, BLM offices. And so it's great to find some fellow travelers here. And we want to tonight present just three reasons why we really care about the lands. Where I think, as you'll hear the presentations, we all have a different perspective. I'm probably more scientifically based, just by how I worked and was raised out there. I worked at the University of Utah for a long time. But so what I want to start is just with a vision of a not quite there we go. A vision of a place that's a little non-traditional in terms of what people might think of in Utah. It's a location called Nash Beacon, and it's Great Basin. In many ways, it has some ties to what we see in southeastern Oregon. And if you look at the geography of Utah. Nash Peak is shown out there in the west center of the state. But if you think about how Utah is uh, laid out, the lower southeast quadrant is really the Colorado Plateau, the uh, high mountain ranges, high plateaus. In the western part of that region, you've got some high mountain ranges with the Sal's near Moab. But then you've got really great red rock canyons cut by the Green and the Colorado and the San Juan rivers and their tributaries. If you go north of there, you're really in Rocky Mountain terrain, either the Wasatch Mountains, which if you're a skier, you've skied those between Provo and Ogden, or the high range to the east, that east-west range, the Uintas. But essentially the western third of the state is truly Great Basin, dry deserts, high deserts, much like their area south of Burns in Harney County or in Malheur County. But in many people, if they've been to that, they might have only have driven across I-80 from Salt Lake City, and that's that's a rather boring segment. But if another way of looking at that area is to look at it the way that the Utah Wilderness Coalition does, and there's an act that's been introduced once again in Congress in the Senate, that known as America's Red Rock Wilderness Act, that is seeking to protect an additional nearly 8.5 million acres of public land managed by the Bureau of Land Management. It's already been introduced in the Senate this session, and we're pleased to say that Senators Merkley and Widener are sponsors. But if you look at this map of the land that is proposed for protection, you see in the Colorado Plateau region, you see the concentration of national parks. You see the two national monuments that are BLM managed, that were slashed by presidential proclamation in the last administration. But you also see proposals for land for protection around those parks. But if you look out in that Great Basin region, away from I-80 and down to the south, you see a large number of proposed protected areas that are now wilderness study areas for the most part, that really do have unique wilderness qualities. And I think Notch Peak stands out as a unique area and sort of a milestone there, much the way that say Steens Mountain does in southeastern Oregon. So the hike itself is not difficult. This is probably one of the tougher stretches that you now can bypass. This is a nice stream bed through a travertine outcrop. But this is really, I think this photo gives you a sense of what the two principal attractions of Notch Peak are. I took these photos in 2008. I think I haven't been up in about 12 years. I've been up in about five times. It's about a 4-hour drive from Salt Lake City, so you can do it in a day if you're Salt Lake City based. I'll give you some ideas for places you can see in the area if you're going to stay longer. But there is a very really nice fault-driven exposure of dolomite in this area. A lot of the Great Basin ranges in Nevada and Utah have really nice exposures of dolomite. And what makes this peak special is there's a nice grove of bristlecone pine trees growing in a moderately protected area just below the summit. These bristlecone pines are not that rare in the Great Basin. You find them in East California and locations in Nevada, but this is a nice grove. It's thought the trees are 3,000 to 4,000 years old, which these trees are in many ways thought to be the oldest living things on Earth now. This is just one tree in one bristlecone pine in closer view. get a sense of just how gnarled and exposed these things are. This is below the summit, so winds can get going here pretty high in winter. Here's a nice view of the bristlecone pine needle structure. Then finally, this is how gnarled the wood gets when you have trees that are 3,000 to 4,000 years old. This is probably the money shot for Notch Peak. Notch Peak is not that high by Utah standards. It's about just a little over 9,500 feet elevation. But this north face of the peak is over 2,000 feet of exposure. And, by some accounts, it's the second highest vertical drop after El Capitan in Yosemite National Park. If you Google Notch Peak now, you'll see lots of people who've made adventure videos with wingsuits. And back, when I was the first time I was going up there, there were rumors of base jumpers going up there. But now, as the self flying technology has evolved, this site attracts a lot of people. I've never run into anybody actually doing that there at the time. But you see, in terms of as you go up, you're not really that exposed. You can go to the edge, but the trail goes up this side. You get some really good views of the canyon below. I think it's close to 4,500 feet down to the desert floor, and you've got a nice canyon. This is fault driven. You see some volcanic rock, some igneous rock that is exposed near the western face of this range, and just drilling in on that exposure. The thing for me is just the magnitude of these Dolomite cliffs. I've been in the Dolomites in Italy, and these exposures are really comparable. And I think it's in this case, the Dolomites don't have this much vertical exposure of this rock in most cases. But you just get a sense of the banding. Dolomite is a carbonate rock like limestone, but what gives it its black color is that some of the calcium in limestone can be replaced by magnesium, and the more magnesium, the darker the rock. And you can see over the millions of years of that these rocks were deposited on the bottom of sea floors. The amount of magnesium flowing in changed because the color varies. I was able to get a shot of some of that banding on close up. I don't know how. I can't give you the number how many millions of years each one of those bands corresponds to, but things changed. This was one of the groups I went up with. I still know the guy on the left, Jeff Egley. I'm often in Zoom conferences with him. The guy in the middle, I don't remember his name, but I do remember one thing. He was crazy. You can see that on this photo. He's actually leaning out over the ledge. In that photo, he's got his hands on a rock edge, but he really went out there for that effect. You've got great views up there. This is looking west across the Great Basin. That's a Tool Valley in front of you. You can see a peak in the distance. That's Wheeler Peak in Great Basin National Park, which is just over the Nevada line. That's 13,000 feet. This is looking to the south, and just like in southeastern Utah, there is a terminal lake. This is Severe Dry Lake, which drains a lot of central Utah. And you see a little bit of agriculture to the left of that near the town of Delta, Utah. But this dry lake is, in many ways, reminds me a lot of what you see from Steens Mountain. And this is a shot I took about 6 years ago from Steens. It was a little moister. It was in June. The other shot was taken in October in Utah. But you get a sense of the comparable geology. It's a fault block range. The rock type is different, though. Of course, the Dolomites that we saw at Notch Peak are replaced by basalts on the top of down. So if you do go down there, there are some things to see along the way that really, I think, to me, summarize the Great Basin or represent it well. There's Jarbidge Mountains, which are a remote range just over the Idaho border in Nevada, south of Twin Falls. Very compact, a lot of volcanics there. There's the City of Rocks, which is a great rock climbing area with some very old rock, south of Burley, Idaho. And then finally, the national park that I mentioned, Great Basin, sort of combines a number of features. That high peak, which is a very accessible peak. It's a good way to test yourself for elevation if you're going to 14,000 or higher on a subsequent trip, with a nice bristlecone pine grove and a limestone cavern. So that's one sense of what one area that I think is really representative of Great Basin section of Utah. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lorenz.
Lorenz, I think you're still on mute.
Sorry about that. Thanks everyone for joining us, and thanks Oregon Wild for having us. I'm Lawrence, and I've been with Oregonians for Wild Utah since January 2020. In the past year, we've launched our website, spoken with senators, and met on a monthly basis to discuss all things Utah and what we can do to protect some of the most beautiful landscape in the world. My story takes us to a lesser known wash near the Grand Staircase Escalante. In 2018, I was working as a guide for a wilderness program in Utah. I would take groups of 4 to 8 alongside 1 or 2 co-guides to all types of different areas around the state. One week we would be mountain biking in Park City. The next we'd be climbing in the La Salles and camping in Moab. Guides worked 8 days on and 6 days off. And for the most part, we spent our off days the same we did our on, just with less responsibility. Escalante was the holy grail of itineraries. It meant you were ready. More importantly, it meant your group was ready. It was a place as remote as we could imagine going with the group, miles away from civilization, surrounded by red rock, muddy waters, and maybe even some bobcats. What you can see on the screen there is the original proposed monument. And back in 1930, the Escalante National Monument was first proposed as a massive swath of land, reaching as far north as Goblin Valley, east towards Blanding, west towards Boulder, south to the banks of the San Juan. The monument never happened, and instead the 2 national parks, Capitol Reef and Canyonlands, were formed, followed by Glen Canyon National Recreation Area, then Grand Staircase Escalante, and finally Bears Ears. For the most part, the original proposal is protected, with some exceptions, of course, but we're really hoping the current administration will reverse the illegal downsizing of two of the monuments, which was Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante. So with the group, we had driven to Escalante, Utah, filled up on gas, and on our way out of town, heading east, we took a right and headed down a hole in the rock road, or I like to call it America's most brutal washboard. And you can see that on the screen on the left there, that red line with Escalante towards the left side. 30 miles later, we took a left, bumped and bounced along an even worse 4x4 road until we made it to the shaded covering of a trailhead. My roommate, who also worked as a guide, greeted us with her group as they were setting off for the same itinerary. There was always at least one more group nearby in case something went wrong. We had a snack, drank some water, put on sunscreen, and started to walk along a wash for several miles until the banks of the river began to rise and slowly closed around us. By late afternoon, we had made it to the border of Glen Canyon Rec Area, crossed over, and pushed for several miles until dinner. The group was feeling good and asked to push on. My co-guide and I didn't see a problem with it, and so we did. At this point, a river had started to form, and we had the choice of either bushwhacking our way through the brush or walking in the water. We tried both, the first being more frustrating than the discomfort of the second. However, quicksand is very real in this area, and especially during that time of the year. So it came as a bit of a surprise when one of the students who was leading the group all of a sudden sank to their thighs in quicksand and quickly looked back at us in shock, but began to laugh. Horrified, I stared at him as my mind began to churn. Is he sinking? What do we do? Can we get him out? Should we throw a rope? Where is my co-guide? An hour later, Using sleeping pads as flotation devices to prevent us from sinking in ourselves, we had managed to dig deep enough to tie paracord to the back loops of his shoes, and with 2 pulling and 2 digging, we got him out. It was late, we were tired, and some of us were a little scared, and we were ready for bed. For us, this place was wild. Even with another group a couple of miles away, we were seemingly on our own, with all we needed on our backs and any hope for the comforts of the van that got us here several days away. The next 2 days were hard. Walking through water, moving through brush, almost getting sucked into quicksand every so often, slowly wore at our morale. We almost didn't notice the beauty of the canyon. Our itinerary was rapidly changing though. What started with a turnaround point at Neon Canyon turned into a hopeful, let's just reach the confluence of the Escalante. The group held on, pushed through, and helped one another carry on. When we turned the corner past the large overlooking tower, the enormous walls that had marked our path opened up to an even larger canyon filled with cottonwoods, junipers, sand, smooth and refined, a couple of rattlesnakes, maybe a ringtail cat, and definitely some kangaroo rats. Our boots, caked with mud, had got us here. The wash's silty water had hydrated us, and we were again ready for dinner. But I had another idea in mind. We carefully hiked our way up a small sand dune that led us to a ridge overlooking the Escalante. We could see north from where the river had made its way through a system of canyons, and we could see south towards Neon Canyon, to which we would never make it. Above us, the sky, blue and brilliant, framed by the darkening red edges of the walls that surrounded us. And then, as we stood semi-perched above the valley floor, in a Walt Whitman-inspired barbaric yelp, a student screamed, "I am human," into the vastness. And one by one, we stood there as their voices echoed into the immediate area. One by one, we watched each student, even us guides, take a turn to express such a simple cliche. And each time we waited in awe as the sounds bounced and bellowed back to us. These places are wild. They're not there to entertain us or there for us to mind them, to blow them up, or to develop them. They're simply just there, providing space for all things, whether flowing, flying, crawling, or walking. And if we're lucky, they'll be there long after we're gone, long after we've had our chance, providing space for other people to visit without ever leaving a trace, to visit and to feel the immense power of the forces so far beyond our control that they humble us simply by existing. Thank you. Kelsey, you're up.
Thank you. That was a really beautiful reflection. And thank you to Oregon Wild for having me. My name is Kelsey Kagan, and I am from Portland, Oregon, in that real deal sense of being born and raised right here. I didn't stray far from home much in my adult life, traveling just down to Eugene for college and a few weird years living in New York. Then my partner, Rye, had the opportunity to move us to Utah for a year-long program. I knew nothing of the place, but I heard there were some mountains and deserts, and that sounded like a nice change of scenery. A year after our arrival, I was dragged out of there kicking and screaming. A couple months into our stay, I was invited to visit the Moab area. I'll never forget that first drive down Highway 191. My head was hanging out the passenger side window like a dog on its first road trip. I'm pretty sure Rye had one hand on my belt loop to keep me in my seat. The massive red rock towers were pulling me in like a siren to a sailor. Every fiber in me was compelled to get closer. After that fateful first trip, I spent every single weekend loading up our truck and driving south. Then I stopped waiting for Rye or for the weekend, and I started stacking my work shifts early into the week so that by Wednesday I could be on the road. This meant that the boundary between home and the ever alluring elsewhere grew exponentially, giving me the opportunity to travel even deeper south. After dozens of solo trips, there was one spot that I desperately wanted to share with Rye. So I waited impatiently for his program to finish to plan a 4-day excursion to Bears Ears, Mexican Hat, Monument Valley, and every dirt road in between. It just so happened that his program finished in the last weekend in July. Have you ever been to the southernmost part of Utah in July? It isn't for the faint of heart or the warm-blooded. We completed several hikes in the early morning hours until the sand started to scald our feet, and we were forced back into our car. This wasn't how I wanted to go out. I didn't want my last few hours of desert to be seen through a dust-covered windshield. I routed us to the closest squiggly blue line on a map, and we drove straight for the water. An old sideways sign said San Juan River, but from the parking area, we had our doubts. From every angle, all we could see was more red, more dust, more desert. We marched down the remnants of an old trail toward a smattering of coyote willow. We figured plants need water, so we must be on the right track. Before even registering that it was a river, we were damn near ankle deep in it. The brown water blended seamlessly with the shore. The siren song rang through my ears. I was being pulled forward again. I didn't hesitate. I flopped belly first into that chocolatey liquid. I floated on my back, letting the current take me, staring up at the pale blue sky. Then I would flip around and tread back to where I started, only to float away again. I was so consumed with gratitude for the soothing of cool water and overwhelmed with the past year of experiences in this remarkable, unique, and sacred place that nothing in the world mattered. Everything else melted away. I had never felt so weightless in every sense of the word. Hours later, I dragged myself back on shore. It was time to leave this place, time to leave all of Utah behind. But I left a piece of my heart right there on the banks of the old San Juan. I dream of that river every single night. No exaggeration. I even wake up craving chocolate milk. After Rye and I were vaccinated and had the opportunity to travel again, I had one destination in mind, that silty river in southern Utah that occupies most of the space in my mind. So I loaded up the truck and we headed south once again. Somewhere about 10 hours into the drive, I started to panic. What if I had built up this place, that experience, and my next visit would fall flat? What if the desperation of cool on a scorching summer day was the only reason that I connected to the river in such a profound way? We pulled the truck down the road that runs adjacent to the river, just beyond Mexican Hat. My tummy was doing backflips and my toes were dancing on the floor mat. Several cars, campers, and trucks were lined up along the road. Shit, I thought, what if I can't even get to the river? We continued past, waving at our fellow road travelers as we drove on, until we made it to the last spot on the access road. The campsite was empty. The truck wasn't even in park before I kicked my door open and flung my body out of it. I raced down the trail, following the sound of rushing water, my siren sound singing to me once again. And there it was. It was even more spectacular than I remember, even on a cold day in early spring. My shoes were already off and the pants came next. I hobbled over the rocks and felt the cold snow melt runoff bite at my ankles. The temperature might have been a drastic swing from my last visit, but I wasn't bothered. I sat right down and let the icy water envelop me. While Ryan packed our gear and tended to the dogs, I stayed hunkered down, shivering, breathing in the crisp air and listening to the delicate flapping wings of the warblers as they gobbled up flighted bugs above me. The heavy contrast of the deep vermilion cliffs that hugged me from all sides against the dozen shades of turquoise flowing over my outstretched legs reminded me of how truly gorgeous striking differences can be. Hard rock, soft water, heavy sun, light wind. These differences all smashed up against each other here in nature. Well, anyone would see this, they would feel it, and they would think it was utterly beautiful. What an alluring example of coexistence. The water continued to hold me as I let it carry everything else away. The weightlessness I had been craving, missing, and dreaming of overtook me again. I was so wholly held, so completely gripped by the earth that there was no room for anything else but me and the San Juan. In a world so heavy, I wish that weightlessness for every soul that walks it. Thank you so much for having me and hearing my love story about a girl and a river. All right, Steve, I'm going to hand it back to you.
So thanks, Kelsey. I'm going to make sure we're on the right slide here. So we want to talk a little bit about our group, and if you're interested in joining us, we have good news. There's no dues. We're informally organized, but we're trying to do 3 or 4 things here that we've become part of the Utah Wilderness Coalition, which is a broad set of nonprofits and businesses that are really actively supporting the protection of Utah wilderness. There is legislation right now, as we mentioned earlier, ARWA, that's been introduced in the Senate with Senators Merkley and Wyden as co-sponsors. And it's going to be introduced soon in the House. And we had a chance to talk to a staffer for Representative Blumenauer a couple of weeks ago. We expect him to be a supporter, along with Representatives DeFazio and Bonamici. We'll keep working on the others. We're also very engaged in encouraging the Biden administration to restore and expand, particularly Bears Ears National Monument, southeastern Utah, and then Grand Staircase Escalante, the west. Personally, I know from my affiliation with the Natural History Museum of Utah just how many paleontological discoveries and specimens have been pulled out of Grand Staircase Escalante since it was created about 25 years ago. We're active in encouraging Bureau of Land Management to create new wilderness study areas, which put areas under protection prior to the congressional wilderness designation. And then finally, we've been actively involved in the role, understanding and promoting the role of Utah wilderness in the 30 by 30 initiative, and particularly as a critical buffer for at least some of the mitigation against climate change. We've done webinars like this in terms of education outreach presentations, and we're really excited about when the public health restrictions fall back, that we can actually go to events again. We are planning a trip, hopefully this fall, if conditions permit, to do so, to participate in sewer stewardship program, doing work to protect and restore wildlands. So if you're interested in joining us, you can look at our website, which is just Oregoniansforwildutah.org, or just send email to info at that same domain, and we'll get you involved. Want to say a little bit about the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance, which is a group that we're involved with. I've been involved with it for over 30 years. And that also is a membership nonprofit. It has a very active grassroots leaders group that meets monthly, and we get very detailed reports about what's happening not only in DC with legislation, but also, quite frankly, ongoing litigation in Utah to ensure that wilderness areas, and particularly Bureau of Land Management practices, are consistent with maintaining these lands. We've got a regional organizer here, Jenny Holmes, who's with us tonight. Sue also has a grassroots leader retreat in Southern Utah. And one of the things I mentioned earlier, Sue does a lot of active citizen lobbying in DC. Usually that's a week in the spring where people descend, but because of the travel restrictions, we've been doing that virtually this year, and I think it's actually made it easier for more people to engage with their representatives than they would for people who don't have the chance to go back to DC. So that's a bit of an introduction to what we do. I hope people have found it appealing. And again, if you're interested in joining us, just send us an email at info@Oregonians for wildutah.org. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Eric.
Okay, thanks, Steve. And if you could turn off your screen share. Seize control. Thank you. Great. Well, I don't know about everybody else watching, but after that presentation, I'm ready to go to Utah, or at least in the next couple of days. I want to get out and go hiking. So hopefully everybody else is feeling inspired. I'm Eric Fernandez. I'm with Oregon Wild. I'm the Wilderness Program Manager, work out of our Bend office here. And I am excited to talk to you just for a few minutes here about some news on the public lands front that we have here. And the good news is the River Democracy Act was introduced for the first time just a couple of months ago by Senators Wyden and Merkley. And this is really good news for anyone who likes clean drinking water, wildlife habitat, forests that store carbon, river rafters, or just any river lover in general. And so I'm going to just talk to you all a little bit and give you the latest and greatest on that. So what is a wild and scenic river? This is a designation that's not quite as strong as the Wilderness Act, but it's pretty good. A wild and scenic river, when it's designated by Congress, so you have to pass a bill through Congress, which is no small feat, but it's kind of like the same process as wilderness. But then you get a protected buffer around the river on both sides. And within that buffer, you won't see any clear cutting, logging of old growth forests, no dams are allowed on the river, and no new mining is allowed. Mining claims, that is. So really good way to protect our rivers and those corridors alongside. So you can still go hiking. They're basically protected for hiking, hunting, fishing, camping, rafting, canoeing, kayaking, cross-country skiing, trail running, snowshoeing. All those low impact activities are encouraged and help allowed in wild and scenic river corridors. If your favorite pastime is recreational bulldozing, not encouraged in wild and scenic river corridors. This designation really focuses on protecting our public lands for the most part, and especially with the River Democracy Act. So it doesn't have any direct impact on private lands and what you can do or can't do. So how did we get to this River Democracy Act that was just introduced a few months ago? Just a few years ago, Senator Wyden started this grassroots process across the whole state to basically call for nominations and say, hey, Oregonians, what rivers should be protected? What's your favorite river, swimming hole, fishing hole, place for hiking, rafting, camping? And he got a lot of feedback during that process. He had it was a comment period. There were a couple of town halls. Oregonians from all across the state nominated. There were like 15,000 nominations for different river segments throughout the state. So it was pretty exciting, and I think that's where the name came from. This River Democracy Act is because there was this grassroots, built by the people type of legislation, and it's come up in numerous meetings. So that conversation continues even over the last few weeks and months. Here's a map of the proposed rivers. It's about 4,700 miles of proposed rivers. And that sounds like a lot. You can see the proposed wild and scenic rivers in the blue lines on the map here. And then you can see these purple lines are the already designated rivers. This is John Day, this is the lower Deschutes. So you've got, this is where I am in Bend. You got the Willamette Valley over here. This green is our public lands, national forest land. So again, while 4,700 miles of river sounds like a lot, that only represents about 4% of all of the river miles in Oregon. So it's pretty modest when you really look at the scope. So this map can be a little bit deceptive, but I did wanted to kind of show you the scope of what's being proposed for protection. And while it's still modest and only 4%, and some people be bold, protect more rivers. We do have other river protections and defense we do, but these are, pretty much some of the coolest, wildest, most scenic, most important for wildlife and biodiversity rivers that we have. So And also one thing that's kind of cool to see here is we have protected some rivers as wild and scenic over the last few decades, but very few in the coast range. And so we're starting, I'm glad to see that this legislation is kind of bucking that trend. And we had legislation that passed in 2019 that also started that trend and did a couple in the coast range, the Nestucca River, for example. So there's your map of the proposal. Here's a pretty picture example. Quite the contrast to the muddy rivers that Kelsey was showing. This is the Mckinsey River, provides clean drinking water to anyone who lives in Eugene, Springfield. Freezing cold water, but super cool. Really important for a variety of salmon, steelhead, bull trout species. This shot is when I took last summer, summer before, just above Paradise Campground. Pretty cool spot. So got to pass a bill through Congress to make this a reality. So if you want to pass a bill through Congress, it's helpful to have bipartisan support. So there was a poll that was done just back in December, very recent, and it showed that, basically asked the question of, do you support protection of wild and scenic rivers in Oregon, more protections? 87% of Oregonians said that they supported that. That's really high. And maybe even more surprising is that 75% of Republicans supported that. I don't think anything has polled that high since they polled on whether or not people like potato chips. Those polling numbers just don't really happen, but clearly us Oregonians, we love our public lands, we love our rivers. And I think, the pandemic has really given us a newfound appreciation for those things, whether it's in Utah or here in Oregon. People get out and disconnect from our doom scrolling on our phones and all of the tragedies happening around the world, the pandemics and masks and everything. Getting out to our rivers and public lands has been a really important thing, certainly for me, and I know I've heard that from a lot of people. I hope everybody else has been able to find a way to get access to nature during this really tough and difficult last year. I think also given an appreciation for things like clean drinking water. Like, yeah, we should probably protect that. That's one of those fundamentals in life we don't want to lose sight of. This is one of the rivers proposed for protection here. You can see, if you look closely, that is a moose. Somebody got really lucky taking this photo. This is the South Fork Umatilla up in Northeast Oregon. Here's another one, Indigo Creek down in Southwest Oregon from our friends at Northwest Rafting Company. Super cool, super biodiverse corner of the state. And this is what you can do to get involved. We'll make the ask really simple. Call Senator Wyden and ask him to pass this legislation this year. And there's the phone number, 503-326-7525. You don't have to be an expert on this. Write it down, give him a call. Most likely, you might just leave a message. All you got to do is say, hey, Senator, thanks for introducing that bill to protect rivers. Please pass the River Democracy Act this year. Boom, done. Really easy. It'll take you like a minute and a half. And that's if you lose the phone number here. So there you have it. My quick spiel here. Last slide here. This is right near Davis Lake. This is Odell Creek. This was from a staff retreat we did. That's Steve Pedri, our conservation director, seeing if he could catch some fish. I don't think he had any luck that day, but beautiful spot looking up at the Cascades there. So that's my presentation, and I think I'm going to turn it over to Allie now, and we can go to Q&A.
Thanks, Eric, and thank you to all the other panelists for your amazing stories and information. So now I'll start the Q&A. So the first question that I have for all of you is, what other types of animals did you see in Escalante?
Well, we saw a ringtail cat, which is super unique, and there's really not that many of them out there. One student said they saw a mountain lion, but we never saw it, but they're kind of sneaky. So I'm sure they were out there, but they didn't bother us. And then just a lot of like little kangaroo rats, which will just jump right onto you while you're eating and go through your food bag. What else? Rattlesnakes are very common, and they'll pop up every so often. And then I think mule deer hang out down there, but we didn't see any of those. But it's definitely a very lively area.
Ringtail cats, I would have thought that was something that only existed in like Dungeons and Dragons. Cool. That sounds like a cool animal.
They're really funny. They kind of just ran circles around us, and they would climb up trees and just watch what we were doing. And we were thought we were in for, you know, a night without very much sleep, because they would come bug us, but they kind of kept to themselves and just kind of watched.
Okay, and then the next question is, how did OFWU form?
So I'll take that. I think Kelsey might. Several of us started communicating in email, and we started meeting monthly in restaurant bars, and then the pandemic struck. And I think that when we're forced over to Zoom, that kind of forced us to organize, set up a website, started doing programs like this, and Jenny has helped a lot with congressional visits. So it's probably a pretty organic formation story. We've got a steering group of about 10 people, and I think about 20 people interested at this point in activities. Kelsey, did I miss anything?
Yeah, just personally, I had listened to Jenny, who is with the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance, do a presentation, and I had just gotten back from Utah. So personally, how I think I got on the email list was asking her, how do I get more involved, and how do I help get other people in Oregon more involved? So what can we do from here, essentially? And I think she had other people interested, and so she looped us all in together, which was great.
Perfect. And then this question is also kind of related, but how often does OFWU meet, and is it a significant commitment to be a part of?
We meet once a month. The three of us and Jenny will meet a little bit more often for other events that we're doing or projects that we're working on, and for people that are joining, they'd probably just start with once a month, and then if they wanted to get more involved, they're always welcome to meet with us and work on some other things. Like we spent a lot of time working on the website, you know, and we spent some time working on this presentation. So
yeah, just to kind of piggyback on that, I think what is great about our group is we have so many people who have different areas of talents or skills or expertise. So as Lorenz was mentioning, when there's a different something that might come up like this, for example, we all had stories we wanted to share, so we kind of stepped into that role, and there's a little bit of something for everybody.
Thank you. I think this one is more for you, Steve, but this person is asking how wide the corridors around the wild and scenic rivers are, and then if you want to just go into any more information, I think now would be a good time.
I think that's for Eric. Or
Yeah, this is for Eric.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So for a wild and scenic river designation, you can have a protected buffer that is either a 1/4 mile wide or a 1/2 mile wide. We have both here in Oregon, and that's on either side of the river. With the River Democracy Act, one of the great things about it is that it includes protections for a 1/2 mile buffer on either side of the river. So that really helps create a much more functional wildlife corridor. You know, the science has shown that if all you do is protect a thin strip of trees along the creek, that's nice, it's a good start, but you really need to protect more of the watershed, more of a buffer for erosion purposes and for a variety of other reasons. So really encouraging to see that, you know, Senator Wyden and Congress are looking at the science. What a pleasant surprise, something we haven't seen as much of as I think we would have liked to over the last 4 years.
That's great. Thank you. And then also relating to water, this question is, how did you purify your water in Escalante?
It's a good question. It's really hard because it's so silty that what we would do is we would take large bladders and fill them with silty water, and then when we poured them into our Nalgenes, we had a bandana over it that would filter out some of the larger particles. But then we just use purification tablets or just a single drop of bleach per liter does the trick too. Using like pump filters or Sawyer squeezes or anything like that they'll just clog up, within a couple of uses. So it's not the tastiest water, and it leaves your mouth pretty dry after drinking it, but it does the trick.
Wow. So with the water you were drinking, was it, after you went through those multiple steps, was it clear or still a little cloudy?
No, not clear at all. Very, very cloudy. There was a picture of me holding that bottle just to show how cloudy the water is while you're drinking it. And if you want to spend some time and just keep filtering it from bottle to bottle through a bandana, it might do it, but I think it's pretty difficult to get it completely clear. But it's not harmful. It's just some sand, so
when you showed that picture for the first time, I actually thought that was the color of the Nalgene, that it had come in that sort of orangey tint. I didn't know that was just.
No, that's just the water that you
that
drink.
was the filtered water.
Yeah.
Wow.
Good for the gut.
Wow, that's funny. I also didn't realize. I thought the same thing, Kelsey. Wow. At least you're staying hydrated. And then here's the next question. What are some key factors for someone going into Utah's wilderness for the first time? What are things that people should consider as they're making this trip?
I'll take a crack now, Lorenz and Kelsey. I think it depends on whether you're going in on foot or you're camping, but it can get really hot there, and the rock really radiates heat. I've been at Arches National Park in December, and when the air temperature was in the 40s, and it felt like it was in the 60s when you're on the red rock, and that to me was a real measure of the heating effect that you get. Dehydration. I think people who go to Saw Canyons for the first time probably don't respect them as much as they should, but obviously any climbing or rappelling in Saw Canyons, and paying attention to flash flood risk. When I'm 30 years ago, I have a memory of some vehicles that were pushed a half mile out of the front end of a slot, and it's really impressive what they can do. So I think it's having a lot of respect for the land, being ready, water, sunscreen, knowing that your salt tablets, whatever you need, and being ready for insects too. Lorenz, Kelsey, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, as hot as it gets, depending on when you're there, it gets really cold too. So if you're camping outside at night, the temperature you have during the day is not going to be necessarily, the summer you should feel you would love the evening, but if you're there in the winter, it's definitely a different environment, and huge drastic swings with the temperature. Lots of layers.
Yeah, I think Edward Abbey said something along the lines of, it's a harsh and hostile land that's beautiful and full of, or teeming with life. And it is, you have to be prepared, especially if you're going backpacking and kind of away from major towns and food sources and water sources. But there's towns all along. So if you're just doing a road trip through the national parks or into some of the monuments, there's lots of resources.
And so one more thing I'll just add is to always be aware and respectful of of the people that do call those places home too. I always try and make it a habit of stopping in town and thanking them for sharing their space and buying some big greasy pile of fries at whatever diner I can find in the closest town. So that's just something to think about when you're out there.
Great, thank you for the tips. That was really informative. This one is also more for Eric, but this audience member is asking if you can go over again how to contact Wyden and what to mention for the Scenic Rivers Act.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for asking that question. I appreciate it. And not that I've never called Senator Wyden's office, but I do have the number memorized. So it's 503-326-7525. Ali, I don't know if maybe we can just, I'll enter that into the chat box here in just a moment. And yeah, and I'll also enter the real simple 1-sentence message, and that's all you have to pass on. They don't ask you follow-up questions or grill you or anything like that. So really simple, but basic message is just, Senator, thank you for introducing the River Democracy Act, and please pass that legislation this year. And you can expand on that for why you like rivers, for clean water, wildlife, recreation, whatever. So you can add on whatever you want, but that's the basic message. Good question.
Great, thank you. So yeah, anyone in the audience, look for that in the chat. Okay, the next question is, what are the current threats to Utah's wilderness?
I think there are multiple ones. I think part of it is human, both due to climate change. You certainly see the impact of dust on mountain ranges in the La Salles and the Navajos in southeastern Utah, causing snow melt. People with motorized vehicles. I noticed in the Q&A somebody mentioned cryptobiotic soil, and until that is very fragile, amazing multi-organism soil type covering, and it takes 30 to 40 years to restore. And you can, if somebody drives an ATV or a motorcycle over that or even hikes on it, it can destroy that. And I think on a broader scale, minerals and energy extraction, there's been a lot of the previous administration, there was a lot of interest in oil and gas. That part of Utah has a lot of shale deposits that are historically been uranium bearing. If you go in the San Rafael Reef area, there are a lot of uranium mines, and uranium is still actively mined in the southern part of the Colorado Plateau, or at least near Blanding. We've even had helium. There was a helium mine or helium well drilled. It was a dry hole earlier this year, right next to a new wilderness area in Emery County. So threats are mostly man-made, and I think there's also a danger of being over-visited. BLM is having to put some restrictions on certain areas. There's certainly not an unknown phenomenon. I've heard near Bend, the Forest Service is beginning to restrict access, and but the one of the appeals of the Utah wilderness is just how wide open it is. But as population grows, and I worry a little bit about the impact of this talk, whether I don't expect this talk to go viral, but certainly photos of things like the wave, which are just over the border in Arizona, have attracted a lot of people.
Yeah, I think that's something we struggle with on a lot of protection campaigns. How do you raise awareness but not risk overrunning a place? And one of the rules of thumbs is advertise it to the effect that it helps drive advocacy, and then as soon as it's protected, never talk about it again. You know, once it's protected, done, forget about it. You never heard about it. I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think there are a lot of guidebooks right now, and
Yeah.
And Southern Utah has been affected. You know, Moab is no longer a secret as a big tourism destination with an active tourism industry there, and that will drive people go further into the area to get the experience.
I think it's also just there's a conflict between some of these amazing places just don't have the infrastructure. And so you want to advocate for them and you want to protect for them. And then you want to build this infrastructure so that people have the ability and accessibility to see the places. But, you know, on one side, less infrastructure, less people, more infrastructure, more people. And with more people comes more trash and more destruction. And so it's really the best thing that people can do is educate themselves about leave no trace and how to enter a place and exit a place without ever really, you know, just leave your footprints and don't leave waste around, carry everything out. You know, how to treat the environment while you're there, and like cryptobiotic soil is so vital for the desert. It basically holds everything together when floods happen, and a lot of people, they're not aware of it because it's fairly obscure, but it's really important to know, you know, what's happening in the ground and on the ground that you're walking on when you're walking through something that appears to be, you know, lifeless and desolate. There's a lot of things living there and a lot of things that are incredibly delicate that we need to be aware of.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you. But we are out of time now. So thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. And then I just want to say, I encourage all the audience members to support Oregonians for Wild Utah and Oregon Wild by becoming members. And then thank you to all the panelists for sharing your wonderful stories and information. This was a great presentation.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks
Thank
to Oregon Wild.
you. It was an honor to be here. Thank you all.
All right. Have a great night, everyone. I'm going to end the presentation now.
Have a good night.